I'd like to provoke you guys to I'd like to invite you guys to a new series of sermons from a prophetic book. So I provoke you guys to open the book of the scriptures in Habakkuk chapter 1, where we'll read from verse 1 up to verse 11. Habakkuk chapter 1 from verse 1 up to verse 11. And let's read this from the scriptures together. Again, Habakkuk chapter 1 from verse 1 up to 11. The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry to you violence, but you do not save me? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings that are not their own. They are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. I believe that every faithful man, has in their heart a question that eats away at us and eats away at all of us. And the question is, Lord, do you not see the unrighteousness? Lord, do you really not see the corruption or the immorality that is around in the world that I live in? Lord, do you not see all these things? If you are good, as you say about yourself in the scripture, when God describes himself in the book of Exodus in chapter 33, God comes down to Moses and says, God is a God full of mercy, full of patience, and rich in kindness. Lord, if you're good, how can you tolerate this? Why don't you intervene in this world to stop evil? And I believe that each and every one of us has this question inside us. Lord, how do you work to stop evil? And the book of Habakkuk is part of a group of 3 prophetic books: Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. These books are written with the same theme, and all 3 of them approximately at the same time period. And the last part of the reign of the north of Judah in Israel, before the people of Israel were about to go into slavery, these prophets activate in work in Judah's kingdom, in David's kingdom, and they start speaking, and they're the prophets of the last few years of Jerusalem, before Jerusalem was to be destroyed, the prophets that God uses to speak for him. There are some voices that speak about God for the generation of slavery, the voices that warn yet again about what is to come. And all these 3 prophets are placed in the same time period and have approximately the same message. And we want to speak about Habakkuk because Habakkuk is atypical in all ways. And it's very interesting that the prophet Habakkuk is similar to us. And you may say, how? I'm not a prophet. But Habakkuk was not a prophet in the classical way of thinking. The prophet of the Old Testament was a person that would signal certain abuses or injustices or unrighteous stuff, and would come out publicly and shout from on God's behalf towards the people against the king, against other public figures or nations. And Habakkuk never prophesied publicly. His book is a memory or a journal of prayer. Habakkuk doesn't propose that what he presents is this book to be something that is typed up on newspapers and published everywhere. No, the book of Habakkuk is a journal of prayer. And God has allowed this journal to be published in the Bible, and the Holy Spirit has prepared this message for us. Habakkuk was a man with interior frustrations, struggles, and a man that while standing in God's presence says, God, look, I'm looking around me and I don't understand. How are you good? How are you merciful? And yet so much bad and evil, and you tolerate so much unrighteousness, and more than that, there's a lack of justice everywhere. Evil triumphs over good. So the book of Habakkuk is special because it presents the dialogue, the personal dialogue between Habakkuk and God. Moreover, it's very interesting compared to the other prophets. Habakkuk does not accuse Israel ever. His goal in prayer or in prophecy was not to find the wrong things in Israel and his people, because even though he could have found many, he chose not to prophesy against them, which makes him special. So he's very much like us. Why? Because he lived in a corrupt world, in a corrupt generation, where evil invaded with strong power, and he had a bunch of questions to God's address. Questions to which God answers. And this is fascinating. He was frustrated, and this was a question that frustrated him. How is God good? And whilst there's so many tragedies and evil around the world, how can God's mercy and kindness match up with all the evil that the people that love God experience? And Habakkuk has this problem and brings this question up before the Lord and starts praying. The book of Habakkuk is a cry for us to understand. You need to understand the literal way that this book was written in. It was a cry, not a declaration of war, not I don't know how to describe it, a document, an official document. No, but it's Habakkuk's own personal cry, personal dilemma, personal problem, a description between the prophet's dialogue between him and God. And in this personal cry, in these personal questions, he raises awareness on the problems that are growing in the world, and God answers him. And more than that, Habakkuk asks him to intervene, presenting the awful situation that they live in, where evil prospers, and asks God to do something, to intervene. This is what the book of Habakkuk actually is. Habakkuk presents the awful state that his nation is in, and the fact that evil prospers, and asks God to intervene and to do something. The structure of the book is pretty simple. Chapter 1 and 2, the first part up to verse 5, are two questions that Habakkuk asks, and to each one, God comes with an answer. Habakkuk has an answer, God answers another question, God answers again. And then the second part of chapter 2, towards the end, God speaks and presents five awful things, five things that are coming towards five specific category of people: the immoral ones, the idolaters, and we'll speak at the right time about them. And God predicts certain events that are to happen against them. And finally, the chapter 3 is a psalm, a song, a poem towards God's greatness. Habakkuk understands God's answer. He delves in and understands God's answers. And in chapter 3, Habakkuk, after he finds out all this information from God, he falls into praise, to praise God, to thank God. And today we're going to speak about the first question that Habakkuk has. Next week about the next question. Then we're going to analyze the five categories that God speaks about. And then finally we're going to have chapter 3. So we're going to have 4 parts of this study of the book of Habakkuk. So now let's read the question again that Habakkuk puts from verse 2. Habakkuk, again, chapter 1 from verse 2. How long, Lord, must I cry for help, but you do not listen? And often follow it with me. How long, Lord, must I cry for help, but you do not listen? I call out to you violence, but you do not intervene. Why do you force me to witness injustice? Why do you put up with wrongdoing? Destruction and violence confront me. Conflict is present, and one must endure strife. Destruction and violence confront me. Conflict is present, and one must endure strife. For this reason, the law lacks power, and injustice is never carried out. Indeed, the wicked intimidate the innocent. For this reason, justice is perverted. What a question. What a question. He says, God, look, listen, there's so many problems. These are the problems I confront myself with. I think I'm righteous. I think I'm just. And yet I confront myself with so much evil. And he says, God, why are we in this situation? Because your law is neglected. Your law is without power. This thing brings towards violence. This thing brings forth violence and injustice. Violence and unrighteousness. And these things are tolerated, God, by the corrupt leaders of Israel. By the corrupt king. And I want to tell you how Habakkuk activates in this period of time. And he acts in the time of King Joachim, one of the last kings that turns back to the deeds of Manasseh. For those of you that know, and if you don't, it's time for you to find out. Go read. Ezekiel was one of the best emperors that Judah ever had. To Ezekiel, a son is born, Manasseh. That was the worst king of Judah, the absolute worst. Brings forth idolatry and so many evil things in Israel. And he rebuilds the temples for the other gods and to praise Baal, and brings Israel more into corruption. And Habakkuk says, God, your law is without power. There's so much corruption, there's so much violence, and there's so many things. People, the righteous are confronted with violence and face so much injustice. Because God, you allow for the king and the priests to be corrupt. Because you allow for the spiritual leaders and the political leaders of the nations to be corrupt. And now I want to ask you something, dear people. Does Habakkuk's situation, is it any much like ours, like the times that we live in? What should I vote for at the following election? I have the duty to vote, I have the right to vote, but I look at the whole political case and it's all corrupt. I don't like saying this, but almost everyone, let's not generalize, but it's not good to generalize all. But most politicians are just as corrupt, no matter what colors they find themselves under. And I look at our generation, I look at my generation, at the spiritual, and I see that the spiritual leaders are corrupt as well. Most religious systems are already going bankrupt because they treat everything with pride, with arrogance, with hidden interests, and you can see this with an open eye. And that's why churches, many of them, fade away. Political corrupt leaders, spiritual leaders that are corrupt. And I'm in the same situation as Habakkuk. God, we love you. Why do you need to tolerate? Why do we need to tolerate these things? And he makes a cry towards God and says, how long will I shout before you? How long, Lord, must I cry for help, but you do not listen? I call out to you violence, but you do not intervene. Why do you force me to witness injustice? Why do you put up with wrongdoing? So there's two questions here. Till when, God? And why, God? Till when, God? How much longer should I endure this? How much longer should I tolerate this? How much longer, God, do you want me to go through this? How much longer should I put up with this? And the second question that is born is why? Why, God? Why do you allow this? Why do you make me go through this? Why me? Does this sound familiar? Does it sound like you? Yeah, he has the same questions I have many times. He has the same questions that probably you have many times. Till when, God, and why, God? Habakkuk, a man of prayer, he reached a point of climax in his understanding where he couldn't carry on going, couldn't understand anymore. He said, God, why? How much longer can you tolerate? Because you're holy, you're kind, you're merciful. You're all powerful. Your eyes are so clean, says chapter 2, that you cannot stand evil. How much longer will you tolerate this? I can't stand it anymore. How much longer can you? In other words, God, you are righteous. You are good. Why do you allow evil people to carry on to prosper in their violence and their suffering? To carry on purging with violence and suffering. And this question is not just of Habakkuk, but Job had it too. If we go to Job, Job chapter 19, verse 7. If I cry out violence, I receive no answers. I cry for help, but there is no justice. He has blocked my way, so I cannot pass, and set darkness over my paths. Those, the innocent, the people of God were surrounded by evildoers, and evil clearly prospered in that civilization in that time. So now I want to ask you: do you find yourself in a similar time that Habakkuk find himself in, that Job find himself in? Are you of those people that suffers from oppression, from people that are stronger, from the violence of a abusive husband maybe, or the fact that you are under a boss that oppresses you, or the situation that we live in oppresses us and rests the pressure on our shoulders? You're obligated to live in a context where you see sin, unrighteousness, and you have a family maybe that your parents, your children are in a constant state of sin. Maybe they consume alcohol, they speak wrongly. Maybe you're in a dirty environment, but you can't leave. That's your home, that's your house, and you say, God, how much longer should I stay here for? How much longer must I endure? Why me? You pray for God to intervene, and yet you feel like nothing's happening. Maybe you, like Habakkuk, are looking up towards heaven and saying, God, what is your answer to all of this? God, I can't stand it anymore. I don't know what direction to go in. This was Habakkuk's situation. And Habakkuk asked God, what do you do to stop evil? And I look at you and nothing changes. We're in the same situation. God, what do you do to stop evil? This was Habakkuk's question. Maybe it's yours as well. And in the moment that Habakkuk asks this question, God answers him. And from verse 5 up to verse 11, God brings an answer. And let's read it together. Look at the nations and pay attention. You will be shocked and amazed, for I will do something in your lifetime that you will not believe, even if you are forewarned. Look, I am about to empower the Babylonians, that ruthless and greedy nation. They sweep across the surface of the earth, seizing dwelling places that do not belong to them. They are frightening and terrifying. They decide for themselves what is right. Their horses are faster than leopards and more alert than the wolves in the desert. Their horses gallop, their horses come a great distance. Like a vulture, they swoop down and quickly to devour the prey. All of them intend to do violence. Every face is determined. They take prisoners as easily as one scoops of sand. They mock kings and laugh at rulers. They laugh at every fortified city. They build siege rams and capture them. And they laugh at every fortified city. They build siege rams and capture them. Have you heard what God said? And let's look at it together, because many times I read this text, but I never looked at it carefully. Let's look at it carefully together. Have you heard what God said? God says clearly, I know in detail about the fall of Israel. I know exactly the sin that Israel finds himself in. God comes down to Habakkuk and says, listen, Habakkuk, I know very well your problem, the context that you live in. I know everything, Habakkuk, don't worry. I'm in control. The fact that he speaks like this to Habakkuk, Habakkuk, he doesn't say, Habakkuk, cast your eyes over. No, God says, look, everyone, look towards the Babylonians. So clearly Habakkuk wasn't just praying by himself, but he was praying in the name of all the the people that were still workers of God, that were still innocent, that were God's men. He speaks on behalf of all of them, and God answers to him as if he answers to all these people. He says, "Look your eyes over to the Babylonians. You won't believe what will happen, even if someone was to tell you to foreshadow it. Be amazed at the work that I will do. Allow yourself to be surprised. If someone was to tell you what." You're about to do, what's about to happen. You wouldn't believe it. And what is this extraordinary work that God does that we wouldn't be able to believe? And look at verse 6. I am about to empower the Babylonians, that ruthless and greedy nation. They sweep across the surface of the earth, seizing dwellings, places that do not belong to them. You know who the Babylonians were? A big, strong nation. The Babylonians. And those of you that know a little bit of Attic history, the Babylonians were extremely cruel people and violent people. Observe what God says here. That his work, this supernatural work, strange work, amazing work that you cannot believe, is that God will allow for the evil people of Israel to be punished from people who are worse than them. The Babylonians. So God, for God to stop evil in Israel, will bring an even bigger evil. And this is shocking. Even for me, it was shocking. And the second question is, why, God, will you use evil to stop evil? Because this is a mystery that completely baffled me initially. When we'll speak about the second question of Habakkuk next week, God will answer why he will do this. But it's shocking. God says to stop evil in Israel, of the religious leaders, of the corrupt leaders, I'll bring before them and before you guys, because they will also found themselves in the people, even if they weren't evil. God will bring a even worse people to destroy them. The Babylonian nation is a miracle of history, and it was the whip that God used for that generation of Israel. The Babylonian nation was born in less than 20 years. And that's amazing. How are you going to reach a global world-dominating force in 20 years? The Babylonian nation was born in less than 20 years from a group of almost inexistent people, completely different and distinguished from one another. An army that swallowed the Syrian nation, the Syrian army. The old Syrian capital, they destroyed it in the year 600 BC, and then Nineveh in 612 BC, and then 610 Haran. All the central areas of the Assyrian nation were enslaved by the Babylonians in less than 6 years. In 6 years, they destroyed the whole Assyrian nation that gathered up miles and miles on end. Spanned miles on end. And then they took over the Pharaoh of Necho. The Pharaoh Necho that crushed the Egyptian empire, that was one of the greatest empires at that time. So the Babylonians swallow the Egyptians, swallow the Syrians, and in Karkemish in 605 BC is where the Pharaoh was destroyed. So just after he destroyed the Assyrians, they destroyed the Egyptians. So in less than 15 years, the Babylonians took over two of the greatest empires in the world, swallowed them completely. The Babylonian nation was God's whip for all the nations that lived in sin at that time. And at the same time, they disappeared just as quickly. In less than 70 years after they took the Israelites in slavery, after 70 years for God's word to be fulfilled, they were then destroyed and conquered by the Persians, so that Israel can be taken back home. The Babylonians were clearly God's whip for those nations. It had an activity of approximately 70-80 years. That was their influence over those nations, and was enough to reform, to punish all those nations. In 80 years, the Babylonians lifted up into glory, destroyed and captured so many nations, and were brought down to dust as well. To teach the Israelites a lesson, God finds as a solution to punish them through a people that is even worse. Observe how God describes them, and I ask that you follow with me. Verse 6. I'm about to empower the Babylonians that are ruthless and greedy nation. They sweep across the surface of the earth, seizing dwelling places that do not belong to them. They are frightening and terrifying. God says this about them. And God says, imagine hearing this from God. Listen, in the close future, in a couple of years, you're going to have everyone, all this nation of people, all this whole bunch of people that are aggressive and violent. These people that are ready to an army that is capable to dominate vast territories. Most empires, though, at the time had a great struggle to maintain the territories that they conquered, because their army was limited by time and space. And God says there'll come an army that is aggressive, volcanic, terrifying, frightening, that is capable to dominate and seize vast territories, that is able to control them. They'll confiscate all the gold or the treasure that you have. Frightening and terrifying. That have their own, that decide for themselves what is right. And don't respect any authority. Rebellious, that have nothing to do with the elderly, with noblemen, that treat everyone equally, killing everyone no matter what background you're from. Their horses are faster than leopards and more alert than wolves in the desert. Many Israelites thought that the fact that the Babylonians were far away from them, they weren't in danger. They were at no threat. But why? What's the point of them coming to here? They have miles and miles and hundreds of miles of Syrian territory to come to us. And God says, listen, don't rush. Their horses are fast, like leopards. They're going to get to you quickly. More agile than the wolves. Like a vulture, they swoop down quickly to devour their prey. All of them intend to do violence. Every face is determined. They take prisoners as easily as one scoop sand. Their intent is clearly to destroy, to do violence, to steal. They couldn't care what treaties of peace, what wealth you have to pay them off, because they'll take it anyway and kill you. In other words, your captivity is imminent. They laugh at every fortified city. They build siege rams and capture them. Your fortifications can't help you. They mock kings. They destroy every city and every castle that could possibly, every castle that could possibly defend you from their wrath can't defend you. And when God exaggerates and describes such a nation, you can clearly tell that it's a big threat coming. And yet in the same way, God destroys this nation. God, even if it's so big and so impressive, the force of this nation, it's in God's control. God clearly puts boundaries and puts a leash on this beast, saying, come back. As soon as God was done with his work with the Babylonians, God brings them back. As soon as God's done with this nation, you can clearly see that it's enough. Their fall, as I said, was in about 20-30 years. A nation that doesn't have a standard of values. And if you were to hear God's answer like this, and you were Habakkuk at that time, and you heard that God's solution is to bring a nation that is even worse, that sees nothing but violence and murder before itself, that has no limits in its pouring of wrath. Your heart seizes up inside you. This is your solution, God. What kind of solution is this? What kind of logic is this? I know we're bad, but your solution is to destroy the good and the evil people altogether? How can a bigger evil destroy a lower evil? How can you fight fire with fire? How are you going to stop this? And this we're going to find next week. Cliffhanger. Hopefully next Friday with God's help. I want to end with this first question, announcing the things that we should highlight. God says, God, I can't stand this evil anymore. How long can you stand it? Why do you allow it? And God comes with a solution that shocks and amazes. And God says, for me to destroy evil, I'm going to have to bring a bigger evil. And Habakkuk is shocked. And we'll see next time what Habakkuk answers. And we want to learn something from this first dialogue that Habakkuk has with God. Firstly, the fact that it's acceptable in before God to open up your heart and to put uncomfortable questions. So, it's acceptable before God to open your heart up and to put uncomfortable questions. There are many people that fear to ask God uncomfortable stuff. God, why'd you allow this, that, and the other in my life? How much longer do I need to suffer? God, how much more should I suffer violence? How much more should I be oppressed? Me, who I love you, I work for you, I'm your child. How much longer will my justice, my righteousness be stepped on? How much longer will I suffer unjustly? How much longer will I be oppressed and violence will be manifested against me? How much longer? How much longer, Father? And God gives you the right to ask. We see from this journal, from this intimate journal of prayer that Habakkuk has, God didn't say, how dare you ask me such questions. But God says, yes, Habakkuk, I know. I can see. I know your struggle. I observe the things that you're dealing with. I can see them. Firstly, you're allowed to ask uncomfortable questions. You experience these sufferings, these disasters, these unjust events in your life. God allows you to put these questions. Come down in prayer and say, God, I'm so tired. I don't know what to do. How much longer should I stand these things? How much longer are you gonna allow these things in my life? You're allowed to ask. Ask. Because the moment you start putting up questions, you might find yourself receiving answers. God lets you ask. More than that, if God allows you to ask uncomfortable questions, more than that, you need to be willing to accept uncomfortable answers. God says, listen, I'll let you ask me, but let me tell you my uncomfortable solutions to your questions. God says my solutions, you wouldn't believe them if someone else was to say. If you weren't to live through them, you wouldn't believe them. My solutions are unexpected. They're strange for you to conceive. God's solutions in your life may not always be the ones that you accept. You want, you accept, you expect, you wait for. Sometimes God's solutions are weird and you don't understand them, but they are revolutionary for your life and truly bring transformation. If God gives you the right to put uncomfortable questions, open yourself up to be willing to accept uncomfortable answers. So many people only want to hear the answer that they want, and they're so sad and broken when God gives them other answers that they don't want, that they didn't expect. The moment then when Job starts asking questions to God, God, why am I here? Why is this happening? Why am I suffering? You know how God answers him? Job, did you know were you there when I put the stars up in the sky? Were you there when I put the foundations of the earth? In other words, Job, are you capable to understand my work in its complexity? You know what Job says at the end of his book in chapter 42? Job says, God, forgive me because I have spoken about things that are beyond my understanding, that I do not know. Forgive me because I dared to step before you, to question you on things that go beyond me. God never said, Job, what are you asking? But Job was willing to accept answers that weren't comfortable for him. Dear loved one who you're listening today, God allows you to put up questions. I provoke you to pray, to put up questions before God. Be like Habakkuk. Ask God. Stand before him and say, God, why am I here? How much longer should I stay here? Why did you accept me, who I love you, to be treated so unjustly? That's what Habakkuk did. But accept the uncomfortable answers that may or may not follow up, even if it's hard, even if it's strange. More than that, we need to learn something else from this book. That God knows in detail the situation of the unrighteous, of those treated unjustly, of those oppressed by evil. Even if God lives in heaven, He is a God that is close to us. That's what the scripture says. You're close you're close to us. You strengthen those with weak spirit. We have a God that knows in detail what our situation is, what our suffering is. And I want to tell you something. When a man suffers, God understands him most, understands him best. Isaiah 55 presents Christ as a man that is pushed aside, a man of pain and suffering and used to suffering. He was so tortured and so pushed aside that we turned our face from him, and he carried our sin and our punishments for us. He was killed for our sin. The punishment that gave us salvation fell over him, and through him we are saved. Christ was clearly the most unjustly treated person on the face of the earth, because us who are evil, who are sinful, we deserve all the things that happen to us. But Christ didn't. I was speaking last night with the youth of our church, and the question was why do bad things happen to good people? We're bad. The question is, why do good things happen to bad people? All the questions that we receive are God's grace in our life. So this morning, I want you to be convinced that God understands our suffering, your suffering. God understands those who are treated unjustly, those that suffer. God understands this question. Till when? In God's presence, a number of martyrs that were decapitated. Do you know where God put him? Not in a corner of heaven for him not to hear. But the word of scripture says that under God's throne, their blood shout day and night. Till when, God, will you not bring justice? Would you believe that if God didn't want to hear them, he couldn't just push them away somewhere he couldn't hear them? But no, God kept those who were treated unjustly and who suffered unjustly, put them right at the feet of his throne to hear them. God will bring righteousness. God will bring justice one day. God told us that when he spoke about that widow that was going to the unrighteous judge. Says there will be a day where God will bring justice, because there's a day of judgment that's coming up, and that's the last thing that I want to remind you guys. I want to tell you from the very beginning that justice and revenge isn't ours. The scripture teaches us and says that justice is his. He's the only one that has the right to take on revenge and enforce justice, and let him be the one to do it. I know it's hard to push aside your emotions and avoid taking on revenge, saying those few extra words that you want to tell someone, throwing that punch maybe. Before hatred, before violence, before anger, before the lack of justice, before the lack of righteousness where evil prospers, the best thing that you can possibly do is to pray. To pray and to come before God and say, God, listen, you're the only righteous judge. Why don't you do something? Not for you to take action. Habakkuk could have very easily put his hand on the sword and to stand up with those that were righteous and to start a rebellion or something. But this isn't God's method. God's methods go beyond our understanding. You need to start praying and say, God, please be righteous with me. Be righteous with me. Be righteous and bring justice in my life over things that I'm praying for, that I want. Dwell in prayer. We learn from this dialogue that God allows you to put uncomfortable questions. Put them, ask them. Put these questions up. God, why do I need to live in such a society, in such an environment? Why do I need to live and dwell among so much evil, among so much sin? Ask him. And then wait for his answer. Open yourself up towards uncomfortable answers. God allows you to put uncomfortable questions, and now wait and allow for God to answer to you in any way that he wants. Maybe a completely different way to what you expect. God's solution is not always a solution that you think is best. God's solution is a supernatural one that goes beyond your logic and your understanding that, but one that always has in mind the good, the better side, that has in mind your prosperity. When Jesus was talking about him dying on the cross, his disciples, what was his disciples' answer? God, stop saying that. Wait, what kind of plan is that? Why are you leaving? The Jews, the apostles only had a certain plan in their heads, that somehow Christ was going to free them from the empire of the Romans, lead them into prosperity. But through his sacrifice, Jesus had a whole different plan, that he was going to free them forever, not just from the Romans. It had no logic, the answer, Christ's answer for the disciples and for the they were completely disappointed by the way that God worked, by just dying on a cross. And yet his answer was one that brought salvation and brought heaven and it was the answer that they needed. God knows in detail the situation that you find yourself in and understands you. Because the most unrighteously treated man, most unjustly treated man was Jesus. The man that lived the most unjust life was Christ. Christ understands those that are pushed aside, that are abused by the evildoers, by those who experience violence in their life, that have so much sadness in their life, and that are in such a context that they are permanently struck, whether verbally, whether physically. Remember, remind yourself what life Christ had with the Pharisees, with the lawmakers of that time that were waiting to strike him down with every word. This was Jesus' life, a life of suffering. And don't forget that there's a day of judgment that is coming. I want us to think about these words, put them to our hearts. I know it frustrates us, this question, how can God use evil to destroy evil? Read ahead. But we'll speak more of this next time. Until then, let's think on this. Let's dwell on these things. Come before prayer and ask God. We're like Habakkuk. Maybe we're not like the prophets that shout in towards a whole nation of people, and to warn and to strike down and to bring God's word and threat. But open up your heart like Habakkuk and ask God these personal questions. And then allow God to answer the way that He wants. Accept God's uncomfortable answers that He may bring you. And do not forget that God knows you in detail and knows your situation exactly, knows how unjustly you are treated, knows how your justice is stepped on. In Jeremiah, he says, when the justice of a man is stepped on, does God not see? He does. And He knows in detail. And remember, there is a day. Do not forget that there's a day where justice will be brought. There's so many people that were treated, that were martyrs and died unjustly and were treated and were persecuted and lived a life full of injustice. There will be a day where God will bring judgment, will bring judgment, will bring justice. There will be a day when God will bring righteousness. Wait for His day to come. Wait for the day where God brings His revenge. And when God brings righteousness, no one can bring justice like He does. No one can intervene in your life and bring righteousness as God can. And with these thoughts, I'd like us to head towards prayer. And I'd like us all to pray this morning, and may God listen to us.